Let's begin with the singing of Morning Has Broken. It's a request from Skip that we sing this song, 664 in your hymnals. Morning has broken, and remain seated if you would. Has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, singing fresh from the word. Sweet the rain's new fall, sunlit from heaven, like the first to fall on the first grass. Praise for the sweetness of the wet garden, sprung in completeness where God's feet pass. Mine is the sunlight, mine is the morning, born of the one light Eden saw play. Praise with elation every morning, God's recreation of the new day. For our verse of scripture today, a verse that impressed me as an adolescent, and I thought of it since Skip works with children largely, or up to 18-year-olds, and this from 1 Timothy. God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. Would you join me in prayer for the world and for our spirits? Let us pray. We pray a prayer of thanks and intercession for our world and the life you are giving us. We thank you for the rain to replenish our aquifers, to brighten our beautiful grounds, to clean the air. Thank you for the beauty of this time and place. We thank you for health and peace. Thank you for good news from doctors, for the emotional and physical support we feel from the staff and facilities. Thank you for companions on life's journey. We thank you for the churches and chaplaincy ministry that feeds our spirits and restores our bodies. We pray for the world you have made, where there's conflict in Israel, Palestine, in the Ukraine, in Sudan, and lesser conflicts in South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We pray for all mediation and peacemaking efforts in those regions. We pray for our sisters and brothers who are waiting for a higher level of care or are facing difficult transitions or financial decisions. We thank you for the staff and our pension plans that make our decisions better and guide us on our way. We thank you for Lent. Help us to be creative about what to give up or take on, and help us to come closer to you in these 39 days until Easter. Thank you for opportunities to worship in community as you, Holy Trinity, model for us. Bless Skip as he speaks of his life's work, and thank you for he and Judy's addition to our community. All of these things we pray in the name of the one who loved us first, Jesus Christ the righteous. We follow him to the cross and resurrection. Amen. Skip Baker hails originally from Ohio, where he was born and where he went to college, the College of Wooster, from where he received his Bachelor of Arts. He went to med school at University of Cincinnati. After marrying Judy in 1967, he came to Children's Hospital of LA, where he practiced pediatrics. He'll have to tell you how he settled in La Cañada, where they raised their 3 children. At church, he's been on session. He's taught, presumably through La Cañada Press, and been part of men's breakfast and a men's life group. Skip and Judy have traveled a lot, to Romania with World Vision, where they opened an orphanage, camping, fishing, and to the tropics. Skip continues an active medical practice where he specializes in behavioral pediatrics. One thing I learned from Suzette McGonigal is Skip is a pediatrician, not a psychiatrist, which I was confused about. So he's going to speak to us about the behavioral, understanding the neurobiological basis of behavior, and it's a way of introducing him to our community. They've been here since December of 2024. Skip?
Thank you, Tom. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you guys and to explain a little bit about what's happened. The last 25 years of neuroscience research, most of us that have never had any learning in that area, but it's revolutionized our understanding of brain and brain functioning. Kids today are getting this in their education programs. Physicians are finally getting some training. When I first started, psychiatrists were not being trained in medication management. It was all belief, this was all in our environment. So the reality is we've come a long way. So I want to go through some things with you guys, and we'll see if it's working. Perfect. Okay. So my dad went to College of Wooster also, where I followed him, and my brother did too. But the chemistry, he was a major in chemistry, which I was, but he had a professor of chemistry, Dr. Chittum, who at the time said 50% of what we're teaching you is wrong. The only problem is we don't know what 50% that is. And the reality is, as time has morphed and as we understand science, what we believe today in science isn't necessarily what we believe tomorrow based on research. And part of the struggle that a lot of people are having that have no science backgrounds is recognizing science is not an absolute. It is a progression. But science keeps us from kidding ourselves. It's a lot better than making things up. The problem is when we don't know the answer to something, all of us try to fill in the holes to make things make sense. But science has a unique position as an arbiter of our competing views. It is the closest thing we have to a shared objective truth, and alone has the authority to pierce through the cloud of subjective opinions and decide the winners and the losers. Back when Voltaire was active, they actually found seashells at the top of the Alps. Seashells at the top of the Alps. Now, how in the heck do seashells get to the top of the Alps? The Alps. They had no insight into tectonic plates, anything else at that point in time. So, Voltaire said, well, it's rotten fish were thrown away by travelers, and then they got petrified. So he was making something up because he didn't understand what this was all about. Jenner, when he came down with the smallpox vaccine, real amazing story. But he said, and he was warned, you better not promulgate such a wild idea if he values his reputation. Don't immunize people. You better not, because it did not fit with what other doctors believed. The opponents in the USA declared it repulsive. People who got it grew horns and lowed like cows. And besides, it wasn't mentioned in the Bible. People were supposed to die from the disease. Kind of what we've heard recently is people saying, well, we need herd immunity, and that means those of us who are susceptible will die off and the rest of us should be living. In the 1890s, late, half the people in the United States believed that dinosaurs and people lived at the same time. But believe me, there's progress. Now in 2025, it's 40%. So we're making progress, but Lord only knows we're making it slowly. But science does keep us from kidding ourselves. It's a constant process that discovers and evaluates and reevaluates. So this is the search of us. Nothing new. This is our brain. We've been trying to understand and really recognize these differences for years. Okay, I think we lost the ability to turn the slide. Maybe the battery may be down, I don't know. No, it's all right. Oh, it's there? Okay. Okay, in search of us. 100 years ago, or back 15th century, this is a drawing from dissection. There's a big nerve that goes through our brain called the vagus nerve. It goes down to our body. We feel it around our heart. We feel it in our stomach. But they found this big nerve that went down, and back then, before we understood any of this stuff, they believed this big nerve from touch and taste were connected to the heart. Okay, so it wasn't the going up to our brain, it was going to the heart because that's where it seemed to go. Phrenology. 100 years ago, a Dr. Fowler would walk around the country and do this statue. And we talked to people about phrenology, where the story back then was different parts of our brain do different things, which it does, but when a part of your brain worked in one area, it grew bigger, and therefore the skull got bigger. So if people could feel the skull, they were able to tell, were you good at math, were you good at language, and he would go around the country explaining this. Not science-based, purely opinion-based. And that's truly an example of that phrenology skull. And this is what he would do with that exact same thing right there. Okay, amativeness. I want you to know what amativeness is. I want you to go back to the back of your head and feel a little bump right above your neck on the right or left side. That's amativeness. Okay, and by feeling that bump, you have a big bump, it's got more amativeness. You have a small bump, you got small amativeness. Okay? When it's strongly developed, it may represent carnality and licentiousness. When undeveloped, it's cold, frigidity, and indifference towards the opposite sex. Whatever happened to our sexual relations? I don't know. I don't even think we got a Christmas card from them last year. So this explosion of scientific research actually started back in '58. And it started after Russia put the Sputnik up. They put the Sputnik up and everybody got scared, and that was the beginning of the funding for all the science research at our universities. Up until that point in time, there was very little. But it's exploded, science research. The federal government now is trying to cut back on it, unfortunately. It's foolish, but that's what they're doing. But neuroscience has revolutionized our understanding. Much of it has occurred since 1989. Yes.
Skip, would you use the mic?
Yes, okay. Is that better? All right. But a lot of these tools of discovery have included psychology, twin studies, genetic studies, understanding neural pathways, and recently brain scanning has revolutionized our understanding. It's a major impact upon our understanding of behavior and learning. The knowledge is doubling every 2 years. I mean, it's an explosion of knowledge. I only do this now, and it's difficult trying to keep up with it because there's so much going on. So I hope to be able to explain some of this to you today. We're going to get through some of it. We may not get through all of it. I am not going to be talking about memory as much. I'm not going to be talking about dementia and what happens to us as we get older. Time for another talk at some point in time if you want. But the big debate has been nature versus nurture. What is our environment and what is related to the way our brains are built? I have a friend who was always arguing with her mom, who grew up in the 30s and 40s, that it was all in her blood. The grandma always said it's always in the blood. And back then, everybody believed it was in your blood. It was genetically predisposed to be a certain way, and you couldn't change it. She was always saying it's their environment. Well, after arguing a little bit and after our beginning research in neuroscience, she said, yeah, there's a lot more in the blood than we realized. Pygmalion was the base for My Fair Lady, written about 100 years ago. And if you think about 100 years ago, that's when eugenics was becoming popular. And Pygmalion, as the first story that came out, was countering that, because My Fair Lady is a story of nature versus nurture. Eugenics started about over 100 years ago. It was a disaster. Really saying that you were obligated to behave a certain way and you were stuck, you were inferior, and it couldn't be changed. Clinical psychology then emerged. Clinical psychology emerged in the 50s, and most of us were taught and trained in clinical psychology one way or another, because that's what we believe. It's in our environment. So what's happened now is all of a sudden we've got this beginning to understand there's genetics going on also. But understanding psychology made us change parenting, early childhood development. When I went to Romania with Bill Cunningham, they had no developmental psychologists in the country. They had no textbooks that understood young child development. And one of the things that World Vision and La Cunada Press did at that time is funded a developmental psychologist that taught at the university. Understanding relationships, counseling. When I joined the practice in La Cunada, they actually brought a counselor on board, and the community didn't think very much of that idea of having a counselor in a pediatric office. And recovery from things like emotional trauma and PTSD. So we've come a long way. But nature versus nurture, the argument is over. It's nature and nurture. And the combination between what our environment is and how our brains work is truly what it's all about. Explosion of genetic capability and therefore research. The astonishing hypothesis. The man that found, one of the finders of the genetic code, Crick, wrote a book trying to identify the search for the soul. Didn't find the soul. But the reality is, what he found is that certain parts of the brain actually do different things. And that was kind of the beginning of our understanding of how different parts of the brain actually do different things. That's the search for the soul. Now, this is what it's all about. It's the genes. The gene with a long strand, and this is how it hooks together, what they call the two sides, and hooks them together. And what genes do is they actually are the manufacturing system for our body. Molecule combinations, epigenetics. So epigenetics is something very different. There's genetics, which is how our genes work, but there's also epigenetics. Epigenetics has to do with whether genes get turned on, they're working, or they get turned off. And it's based on whether or not things that, whoops, I'm sorry. Whether or not there are little chemicals that attach to the gene that make it work or make it not work. And so the other thing we've learned about epigenetics, it also can be inherited. So if you have an epigenetic change in your brain, not with just cancer, but also behavior, that can also be inherited. So it's just not genes, it's that your genes are ready to be adapted to your environment. And this is what happens. The genes are there, but then these little molecules, and there's about 3 different ones, major ones, that attach and turn on based on your environmental experience. Do genes cause behavior? Do genes cause behavior? No, they do not. They create proteins that change the way our body works. But there are genes associated with behavior, and that's the big research that's going on right now. A good close relative, the monkey, the chimpanzee. What's really interesting about chimpanzees, They do a lot of things we do as humans. Ability to develop and use and teach each other how to use tools. They have a talent for money and trade, a human propensity to pilfer, steal, and deceive, conduct war, and destructive behavior. And we know that's all going on now, and most of that research is the last 20 years. What's interesting is 98.4 of chimpanzee genes or human genes are found in the chimps. 98.4. But that other percent is really important, and that's what distinguishes us from chimpanzees. But before you get too enamored with that, 70% of human genes is found in a slug. Okay, one of the things that's happening now is something called genome-wide studies. It's like throwing a fishing net into the ocean and seeing what you can catch. They're not specifically targeting specific. Trying to do is identify what genes are associated with certain behaviors just by doing this cross-referencing. So you don't have to really look at all this, but these are things that are not associated with genes. These are the things that are associated with genes. And let's look at some of those. Exercise, risk tolerance, lack of sleep, sensitivity to stress and adversity, self-reported loneliness, neuroticism, childhood aggression, self-injury ideation, and suicidal attempts definitively have associations with genetics. And the goal is going to be, as time emerges, for us to be able to start diagnostically using genetic profiles to help identify what people's risks are. With brain scanning, we're beginning to identify these parts of the brain and what's going on with them. Let's quickly talk about learning and variability of learning. This is our history, and we've done it. It happened to my relatives, it happened to other people, it's still happening. There's a man that wrote a book, he said, "You mean I'm not lazy, stupid, or crazy?" Okay? The reality is we've done horrible things to our kids, not thinking we knew what we were doing. So let me go through this with you quickly. So this is kind of a format of the way our brains work. It's just a schema, but give you an idea. So when I was in school, we thought there was one kind of being smart. So people were smart or they were dumb. That's what we used to think. But in actuality, there's at least 8 different kinds of intelligence. So we're better off thinking of our brain working like a pie that has 8 pieces that represents different kinds of intelligence. In every area of intelligence, we're all built on range. Like in this one area, some people are really strong, but other people are really have a hard time. It's not like normal and abnormal, there are ranges of functioning. In school, we don't use 8 kinds of being smart, we only use 2. We use sequential, which is mathematics, and we use language-based. The Art Center in Pasadena, where they train some of the most highly skilled designers in the world, has a math course at college level, like a 6th grade math course. Because people that good with visual spatial design frequently, almost always, don't do the sequential thinking of mathematics. But don't ask the people who are good at mathematics to go and be our creative force, because they're not. Okay, so it's difference in learning. We use 2 in school. We use 2 in school. All right, so we also have something called a preferred learning pathway. How does it come into your brain? How does it come out of your brain? It goes in through our senses, so auditory, visual. When you do things, visual is observing or reading, different processes inside the brain, but observation. When you do things, your brain learns it. Feel things on your skin and smell and taste. Get all the way through college without smelling or tasting. You're not going to make it a week or 2 in chef school if you don't smell or taste. We output information by saying it, by doing or demonstrating it. Or by writing it, I'm sorry, doing or demonstrating by writing it. So my brain works best by listening and talking. The biggest advantage we all have is to adjust our life to fit our style. And we all do it without realizing what our strengths are. We just do it. I have a good friend, John Harrison, who's a movie writer, director, did a special TV movie on Pope, one of the popes. He went to College of Columbia. He never went to lectures. He never went to class. He couldn't auditorily process the lectures. All of his information is gathered by reading and by writing, which he is absolutely outstanding. If I do his job, though, I wouldn't be as happy. Okay? Okay, so that's preferred learning pathways and differences in learning. Now, frontal lobe function, and this is really important because this is kind of the conductor for the rest of our brain. Frontal lobe above our eyes, these 5 things are in different parts of the frontal lobe. And we're recognizing some of the neural pathways of these 5 things. So this is where activity is. Some people are built to be movers and some people are built to be sitters on a range. The attention. Attention determines, is my brain going to go to work or not? If the attention function doesn't work, no matter how smart you are, it's impossible to get your brain to go to work, especially when it's boring, or primarily when it's boring. Because people with attention differences, yes, we've got a label that says you've got it, you don't, but the reality is it's a range issue also. But people with attention differences do interesting, exciting, thrilling, and threatening. They just don't do boring. And that's the guy that wrote the book. You mean I'm not lazy, stupid, or crazy? Inhibitory. Inhibitory stops you long enough. In milliseconds, go to back memory bank in the back of your brain. You come up, and part of the frontal lobe does the weighing and balancing. The cingulate, weighing and balancing, good idea, bad idea. But if you're an automatic reactor, you will do it before your brain does that calculation. And then after the fact, you say, oh, I don't think that was a good idea. Planning and organizing, and mood management. There's a lot of variability. Right now, there's about 30,000 different genes that affect this part of the brain. So it's not one thing, it's a lot of extreme variability. So when we talk about people with, quote, ADHD, which is pretty popularized recently, when you talk about that, there's a lot of difference between people. It's not one thing. Okay, what's really interesting about this is people with weak attention down here, some of the most highly creative people in our society. They think outside the box automatically, come up with new ideas. People over here sit and do the boring all day long. They're creatively weak. So if you like the label attention deficit disorder, then these people have creativity deficiency disorder. It's all a question as to how you want to look at it. Mama, one of the kids I work with is an executive at Disney in one of the creative areas. She told her assistant, I want you to come in and help us with these new ideas. Her assistant looked and said, no, you don't get it. My brain doesn't do that stuff. Give me the spreadsheet, and I'm fine. Okay, the 8 different kinds of being smart. We won't spend time there, but D is for different. Different is a nice change from same. It doesn't mean better or worse. It just means interesting. But D can also be for discouragement. Our education system, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Everybody's a genius, according to Einstein, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life thinking that it's stupid. Discouragement is a bad hair day after day after day until you finally get dysfunction as young adults or adults. That discouragement that occurs in childhood that programs into the nerves in their brain is horribly discouraging, and it happens, and people do not do this. Most of you that have pastors have worked with people with dysfunctional families. I assure you, nobody's ever chosen that I know has become dysfunctional, but it happens. The biggest advantage in adulthood is we get to adjust our life to fit our style. You know, a lot of you have gone through the Minnesota MMPI, early childhood temperamental research emerged. It was some of the beginning of our understanding how differently we are, but we put it in terms of psychology, not in. But the mind is what the brain does. Our mind is what our brain does. Dramatic advance in our understanding. Listening to Prozac first came out in the late 80s. It was a revolutionary concept of a medicine that would reduce anxiety, reduce depression, reduce OCD. The book, as good as it gets, the book, but it was also a story, a movie with Jack Nicholson, if you remember it. Halfway through that movie, he had horrible OCD and anxiety. Halfway through that movie, he said, my doctor told me if I were to take a medicine, I'd do better, but I was so nervous about taking a medicine, I wanted to take a medicine because of you and that relationship. So he started taking the medicine. The whole second half of that movie was his brain working better when he was taking medicine. The brain and therefore the mind. And this is the brain. The reality is different parts do different things. The vision that Crick talked about back here in the back of the brain. This is an example of what we call the motor cortex, which is the part of our brain that makes our muscles work. And looking at that, we can actually map now which parts of those nerves. Look at the motor cortex in your fingers and why when you play piano or guitar, whatever it is, fine motor skills, how big that is. Look at our mouth, look at our foot and our toe, very, very different. And we've got inside our brain, including all these nerves, we've got these little things called nucleus. That's where nerves come together and connect. They're like switching centers. And this is an example of some of the differences that different parts of our brain does. Passively viewing words, that's reading. Listening to words, whole different place. But there are kids and adults that do much better by reading them or much better by listening. I do much better at listening to them. I would rather go to a lecture than I would try to sit and read the same material. My friend John Harrison is just the opposite. Speaking words, different part of our brain, and generating words. So coming up with words, then you got to speak them. But if you're in a conversation, you've got to be able to listen to them. You've got to come up with the words. You've got to generate. So your brain is firing very, very rapidly between these different areas. And we now know that in our brain, these nerves are baked nerves, the branching nerves, and the nerves grow. So when you're learning things, you're actually growing these little tiny connections that go between nerves. And this is the way it looks on a microscopic scan. These little tiny nerves will grow, and as you learn things, you grow more and more nerve fibers. The critical thing between nerves is a signaling between nerves, called a synapse. A synapse is when one nerve comes and connects. There's a lot of synapses. These are all synapses. But microscopically, the synapse is this. They come together, but there's space between nerves. It used to be thinking, well, maybe, early debate, maybe it's electrical signaling to the rest of the nerves. But it's not. It's actually a chemical signaling between nerves. There's no electrical activity between nerves. This nerve makes a chemical called a neurotransmitter. Store a little sac. When it triggers, it opens it, it goes across the space, goes to docking sites of the receiving nerve. That makes the next nerve work. Then it gets released and reabsorbed and recycled. If you don't have enough of the neurotransmitters that work in different parts of the brain, you can't get those nerves to work very well. Okay? It's different in the anxiety center of the brain, it's different in the attention system of the brain, it's different in other parts of the brain. So if nerves aren't firing very well because you don't have enough of the neurotransmitter, genes that affect this, some people don't produce as much of the neurotransmitter. Some people, little sac that holds it has one gene, SNAP25 gene, that means that this little vesicle that holds the neurotransmitter before it gets released leaks. So it leaks it out here, less comes out. Some people's receptors only work at a 50 percentile level. You have a lot of neurotransmitter, the next nerve goes thud. And some people have so many reabsorption channels, it sucks up so fast like a vacuum cleaner. The end result is low neurotransmitters interfere with nerves firing. And what happens with a lot of medication management, this is what it's hitting. These are the receptors. These are the receptors that sit inside the receiving nerve. As you can see, the genes that affect this is a sequence of amino acids as part of the gene. But look at this. See how this loops down? Different genes correct different looping. Some people only loop, some genes, it's only a couple loops like this, and some are really long, but they change the way they will function and fire based genetically. These are some of the nerve pathways. This is norepinephrine. This is dopamine, and dopamine and norepinephrine, the big neurotransmitters associated with frontal lobe functioning. This is acetylcholine, and this is serotonin over here. So the reality, there are different pathways that are like channels throughout our whole brain that are different neurons. So when people use different medicines to try to help brains work better, you're actually targeting different pathways. It's like putting a Band-Aid on your foot and a Band-Aid on your elbow. It's a different part of your brain. Okay, this is a pathway that goes to the frontal lobe. And these are some of the things that are associated with frontal lobe function. This is judgment. It's called the anterior cingulate. We now know the children that have ADHD as a label, it's about 25% smaller. We also have evidence now on brain scanning that when you treat kids young, it actually grows bigger. We don't know what that means long-term yet. But we definitely know you get neurogenesis or nerve growing in the frontal lobe, in the judgment part of your brain. This is where reward systems are. Memory gets started here and goes back here, vision's back here. So different parts of the brain do different things. When you're trying to remember where your keys are, you know darn good, you know darn good and well it's your keys. This is the what, where pathway. Where is the problem, but you always know your keys. So most of us compensate by putting our keys at the same place, and then we don't have to code. Otherwise, you've got to look at it and say, where did I put my keys? You've got to encode that in the nerves in your brain every time you put it down in a different place. And so you're not going to find it because your brain doesn't encode it. Research has discovered that Doogie mouse, if you engineer it to have more receptors and more nerves and better memory, it makes them smarter. Just by engineering with the genetic change, you can make them smarter. When nerves learn, they sprout these cells. They sprout the dendrites, and that's what makes it work. Okay, brain differences, and these are labels. For a long time, we've had to use observations, and it keeps changing. The DSM criteria that you hear so much about is changing, and it's changing on the basis of research. It used to be thought that autism was a form of schizophrenia, clear back when I first got started. And they would just say, oh, this is a schizophrenic kid. There was refrigerator mothers. There was all sorts of thinking that went on that were not true. But ADHD, anxiety, depression, bipolar, one of you mentioned one of your grandsons has bipolar, obsessive compulsive disorder, oppositional behavior. Some of these have neurobiological bases, meaning it's going on in the brain. Some of them do not. Like oppositional defiant disorder doesn't have a specific part of the brain associated with it. But we do know that people who have ADHD who are impulsive and had elevated levels of anxiety have a lot more oppositional behavior. The world according to Pooh. Can you describe what these people have? What about Eeyore? Depression. It's sunny now, but it might rain. Piglet, pretty busy, running around, always nervous, always worried along with the rabbit. But Tigger, the hyperactive, dysfunctional Tigger, busy, active, impulsive, and Pooh is a rather slow bear who always loves sugar. Okay, frontal lobe functioning. We know that these are the characteristics of frontal lobe functioning: poor attention, impulsive, and being busy, but it's so much greater than that. When you look at survey questionnaires, it's much greater than the diagnostic criteria, much greater than those three criteria. There are ways, part of our brain is called the task-active pathway, which is frontal lobe busy. We've also got what we call a default mode network, where our brain goes to work when we're not working. When we're there resting and thinking, sometimes being creative, we're in the default mode network. People with attention problems can pay attention. It just has to be interesting, exciting, thrilling, or threatening. Work a lot with fire chiefs, and a number of them have said, I know exactly who I can rely on in a very high emergency situation. Some of the best first responders have this attention difference, that their brains activate under pressure. There are people whose brains don't. Inactivating attention when it's boring, reviewing, repetition. A lot of our school systems do this because repetition makes our brains learn things, but when it does this and your brain isn't built to do it, it doesn't work. Again, the biggest advantage of being an adult is you get to adjust your life to fit your style, and we all do it. We've all done it without ever realizing it. Guarding against distractions. Brian waits for the untethered flow of his mind to begin. That's one of the ways of adjusting your life to fit your style. Genetic studies. About 80% of people have an attention difference we now know is genetically determined. 80%. The other 20% are like prematurity, head trauma, concussions, repeated concussions, meningitis, maybe prenatal exposure to pesticides, and maybe acetaminophen, maybe, pollution, but most of it's genetic. And the genes affect, as I pointed out earlier, how it works. 30,000 different genes, though. This shows brain scans that first emerged about 25 years ago, and showing when the red is when the nerve is using glucose in a higher level. So people that don't have attention differences has a lot of glucose activity. People who have attention differences, though, can't activate their brain the same way that other people do. And on more recent brain scans, now we call functional MRI scans, you can see the difference. People without attention problems can go to this part to go to work just fine. People with attention problems cannot activate it, but sometimes they'll use the emotional stuff down the side of their brain to get it to go to work. Fearful stories and vile pictures to instruct good little folks. Written in 1845 by a German physician. So this is nothing new. 170 years ago now, he wrote the story about Fidgety Phil, about a little boy trying to sit at a table. Let me see if Philip can be a little gentleman who sits still for once at the table. But Philip did not seem to mind. He wiggled and giggled, and then I declare swung backward and forward and tilted his chair. Here's the label. See the naughty, restless child growing still more rude and wild. You know, the end result was, but he had a whole book full of his patients who had differences in the way their brains worked. Prison populations. Sweden, when they identified people leaving prison and identified the people with ADHD, changed the whole dynamic of what was going on. There's a 70% chance when you leave prison, you're going to go back to prison. When they identified the people who had ADHD and treated them medically, it reduced the risk of going back to prison, 50%. From a societal standpoint, that's mind-boggling. So we're not managing people medically, we're managing them with incarceration. Let's talk a little bit about fruit flies, honeybees, marshmallows, and nomads. Caltech did research on fruit flies. And the way they do some of this research, they've got ways of doing electrodes in insects' brains and doing brain scans on fruit flies. Truly amazing. So they found with fruit flies, they put them in a cage, give them a puff of air. They all fly around and settle down, except a small group of them flies around a lot longer than the other ones do. They found that the ones that fly around a lot longer, when they took them back and looked at the genes that affect their brain, they fly around a lot longer because they have low brain dopamine levels. Then they give them a bad smell, electric shock. They all learn to stay away from the bad smell because they know the shock's coming, except the low dopamine ones take a lot longer to learn from that negative experience. So they don't learn as fast. But on the other hand, they're much more persistent. The sitters versus the scouts. Okay, the dopamine deficiency. What's interesting is the fruit flies or the hyperactive fruit flies respond to the same medicine we give to human beings. You artificially raise dopamine levels in the brain, all of a sudden they're much more likely to not do the same thing. Honeybees. University of Pennsylvania did research on honeybees. They put them in a cage and showed them new flowers. Only a very small number of honeybees are interested in the new flowers. The other ones don't care. The ones interested in new flowers are scouting honeybees. Scouting honeybees are always up on the move. They're always out looking for new food. Even if there's plenty of food around, it doesn't matter. They're always looking for new food. They do not do the boring nectar recovery work. Okay? Guess what? The genetic profile of scouting honeybees is low brain dopamine, just like it is in humans that have attention differences. Okay, marshmallow experiment. Clinical, it was a psychology experiment. They put marshmallow or a piece of candy, walked out, told the child, okay, if you come back, there's one piece of candy there. If you wait, I'll give you two. And so they walked out, and some kids are able to delay gratification, and some kids aren't. The ones that can't delay gratification are impulsive. There was a thing on Facebook the other day of two girls sitting there, and one girl was waiting, and the other one grabbed her piece of candy and grabbed her sister's too and ate them both right away. Is ADHD an advantage to the nomadic tribesmen? The out of Africa migration of humanity? Look at this. From Africa emerging down to Australia, all the way up down to the tip of South America. By the time you get to the tip of South America, the percentage of genes that are associated with low brain dopamine dramatically elevated. So the people who are willing to go up and be on the move, that are willing to go over the next hill, discover, explore, are built with this low level of dopamine. University of Pennsylvania also said if 10 to 15% of our population has this difference, there's got to be a reason for it. So on a computer screen, they created a berry picking task. They put bushes with berries. Said, all we want you to do is collect as many berries as you can. At the end of the study, the people that collected more berries had the most ADHD symptoms. So the people that were the discoverers, the explorers, the people who were willing to go and stick with something. Some people would stick with one bush and say, oh, there's a few berries in that bush, I want to get all those berries. Other people would say, oh no, there's a whole bunch of berries over there, I can get a lot more berries, and that was the goal, and it worked. Okay, dopamine enhancement, okay, sugar. Sugar, they say kids with ADHD crave sugar, and it causes a problem. It does not. Sugar actually enhances dopamine production in the brain. Trouble with sugar is you get a sugar high and then you crash, you get a sugar low. Throws your mood off. Caffeine, we talk about this as a joke. It's so prominent. Modern day society requires focus and concentration. You know, when coffee, all these stimulants hit the world, was we were emerging into the Industrial Revolution, where the first time people had to get up at the same time and do things together. Otherwise, some people would sleep in till 10 in the morning. Some people would go to bed at night, wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and be awake at night in the old history as we look at it. Okay, caffeine, the scouting honeybees I was telling you about. Scouting honeybees go out and find new flowers. They come back and do a little dance to let everybody know where the flowers are. Then they forget about them. Unless they find the flower's caffeine in it and they remember it better. So caffeine activates our brain dopaminergic functioning. What's really interesting, just this week there was an article, if you saw it or not, 3 cups of coffee a day. Now here's a little clue, reduces dementia onset. 3 cups a day does. The question is how much, does it or more or whatever, but it gets that dopamine function of the brain going and it's probably keeping nerves firing. Caffeine is the glue that holds me together. Nicotine. Guess where nicotine goes in the brain? Right to the frontal lobe nerve pathways, just like Ritalin does. So my sophomore year of college, my grades improved 1.5 points. I said, good, I finally learned how to study. I learned a lot about studying, but I also started smoking. My college roommate went to Harvard Law School. When he quit smoking 40 years ago, his concentration span dropped from 3 hours down to 15 minutes. I have a friend who's a JPL engineer scientist, went to West Point, smoked a pipe his whole life. His son had major troubles in school, and his grandson was diagnosed with ADHD and treated. So the reality is a lot of our previous generation, without knowing anything about what we were doing or why we were doing it, were using nicotine for focusing and concentrating. Not a good way to help your brain work better, but now you know what the kids are doing? Zyn packs, that's pure nicotine. Even to the point that Philip Morris last week said we're not going to be doing tobacco sales, we're going to be doing nicotine sales. And a lot of the tech companies up north are actually putting Zyn dispensers in their lobby because a lot of people will use nicotine for this focusing and concentrating. There's no question about it. It's not as bad if you look at toxicity. Smoking is horrible, vaping is less of a problem, chewing tobacco is pretty bad, but the Zyn, which is pure nicotine, is not as bad, but it may have an effect on gums. We don't know yet. But that's what's happening now. People aren't giving it up. Aristotle, okay, exercise. Aristotle, back at the early days of our developmental society, knew that learning required exercise first. They went to the gymnasium before they ever went ahead and tried to do learning formally. So exercise will actually activate our nerve pathways. Mama, one of the kids I work with, didn't do well in school until she started to run cross country. She went to straight A's. During the pandemic, we saw all sorts of kids emerge that had attention problems that never expressed it before because they all lost their team sport. Most of them didn't have their heavy exercise anymore. I saw a young lady last week who's a medical student over at UCLA. She had been using exercise her whole life to get her brain to go to work, and she doesn't have time to do it anymore. And her attention problem emerged dramatically. So exercise makes a big difference. Protective effects of intervening early medically. This is what I do all the time, but let me show you what the difference is. So these are people with different diagnoses. This is depression, anxiety, even bipolar, which is a different biology, genetically. Look at depression. So if you have ADHD and depression in combination, if you're treated with the blue fiber or the blue line versus untreated, depression is dramatically elevated. Look at anxiety and how anxiety gets worse based on treated versus untreated. Even bipolar shows up differently. Antisocial personality disorder, kind of like autism, conduct, severe behavior like the prisoners, and oppositional behavior, treated versus untreated. So when you're treating people and adjusting their brain chemistry, you avoid all this. Look at substance abuse. A lot of you have worked with people with alcohol issues and families and substance abuse issues. This dopamine deficiency in the brain raises the substance abuse risk like 2 to 3 times. And when you treat people medically, it reduces the risk, the general population risk. It's like immunizing them against their brain not working well and self-treating. Because every single of the drugs on the street, except hallucinogens, mushrooms, raises brain dopamine levels. Anxiety. And we'll wrap up with this. So anxiety is our brain's protection system. It sits in a part of your brain called the amygdala, right here. Sits clear down the base of the bottom of the brain. It's not the frontal lobe. Part of the frontal lobe helps you manage that, but it sits down there. So anxiety is our brain's protection system. Go hiking in the woods, you hear a bear growl, you say, okay, I'm out of here. I don't need to stick around to see the bear. People with no significant anxiety will say, oh, it'd be fun to look at the bear, okay? So the reality is anxiety is our brain's protection system. It's a range issue too. Biologically built in, it's probably about 60% of genetic as we understand it now. It's accentuated by experience though. So the more you have negative experiences, the more it grows and gets bigger. We know that people who have higher levels of anxiety, their amygdala is actually bigger than it is in other people, okay? But it predisposes to depression because prolonged anxiety causes stress. And when you get stressed, you release a chemical from your adrenal gland called cortisol. Every day our brain produces about 3,000 new nerve cells. When it's bathed in cortisol, you shut down new nerve growth. And on brain scans, part of your brain is actually beginning to shrink. So we know that prolonged anxiety increases the risk of depression, and I see it all the time. Without it, without some anxiety, guess what? Sociopathy. So what happens if you have attention problems? You're impulsive, you don't think clearly, you try to make decisions too rapidly, and you have anxiety together? Sociopathic behaviors, like our present president. Okay? ADHD and no anxiety. Disaster. Okay, so let me go ahead and anxiety is frequently hidden, but lack of anxiety. Children less than 5 years of age that have no anxiety are predicted to get in trouble with the law because they don't care about consequence. Social fear disappears with elimination of anxiety. So you lower anxiety, people are less anxious socially. But what's really interesting, you eliminate anxiety, it eliminates racial stereotyping. So this, we do know that even babies recognize racial differences. It's difference. It's difference. You know, and white people that go to Africa get looked on, and people keep looking at them. Black people end up in white populations, they get looked at. But the racial difference, but it's racial stereotyping directly related to anxiety and threat and fear. Bullying, kids who are at high anxiety are susceptible to being bullied. I don't care if you're a member of the Sierra Club, Sequoia Club, or Daniel Boone himself, fork over the Oreos. Chocolate has a medicine in it that reduces anxiety. So the Mayans used to give chocolate to their rulers for anxiety reduction. And I had a little boy just recently who was going away to camp, horrible anxiety before we started to help him medically. Parents were scared to death they're going to call from San Diego, have to go down and get him in the middle of the night. I wrote a prescription. He was allowed to get chocolate anytime he wanted to. He lasted the whole week and he had a great time and he got chocolate every time he felt nervous and he survived just fine. Okay, something that may be significant. Now this is observation, it's not research-based. But all of you that are part of ministerial functions know this is the case. The decline of attendance in churches over the last 50 years. This is the declining church membership, but if you look at this, a lot has occurred since about 1995. It was pretty steady from the 40s up until 95. At about 2000 is when it started to decline. Look at that decline over the last 25 years. Everybody's raised their question, why? My suspicion is there's a reason for it. Because what I want you to look at is the rising levels of serotonin-raising medicines that reduce people's anxiety. If I read biblical information correctly, or whatever, a lot of it has to do with reducing people's anxiety. A lot of things we do in church settings is reducing anxiety. All the things that we do that have incorporated into our services and our activities, every single one of those, most of them reduce our anxiety and our threat and our fear. But look at this. The same time that we were raising all these serotonin medicines, SSRIs, it's the same time, look at this, the same time that the declining church population occurred. Is that real or not? I don't know. I don't know, but it's an observation because as I watch neurotransmitter levels being adjusted societally, it has a big impact. Like Starbucks rose on the back of declining tobacco use. We didn't have to use Starbucks all over the place. People would drink coffee, but all of a sudden all these coffee shops emerged. We started to stop tobacco, nicotine hitting the same part of the brain. We started to use caffeine as our mechanism for focus and concentration. Okay, the things we do to reduce stress and anxiety: social connection, acts of kindness, music, meditation. When you do brain scans of Carmelite nuns and Buddhist monks, looks exactly the same. Exactly the same in mechanism inside the brain. And even a higher power. There's something amazing when people are stressed, and it may explain part of what the last election was. When people are stressed, they look for a stronger leader. They look for increased control, which reduces their stress, they reduce their anxiety, reduces their stress. So it's happening worldwide right now, and we're all emerging from the pandemic that scared a heck of a lot of people and made us for the first time. But when you look back at some of these major stresses that have occurred, it's occurred in repetitive function. Autism, just one quick thing. Rather than thinking of autism as just one thing or not, which is what you used to think in terms of this wheel also, because it's not just one thing, there's a lot of variability. And what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years, they've changed the definition. It used to be just this. Then they said, well, there's different levels, so it's a spectrum rather than one thing. Autism shows, and one thing I'll share this with, and then we'll stop. Recently, they started doing brain scans on kids with autism. So they did this back east, and they found that in high-functioning kids, they found about half the kids had too much brain glutamate. Now, brain glutamate is the thing that makes your nerves work better. It's a neurotransmitter. GABA, which is the one that calms it down. But they found that too many kids had too much glutamate. They found that if they gave these kids a medicine that artificially lowers glutamate, it changed what they did. So better facial recognition, okay? Aricept, which is a medicine we've used for Alzheimer's, doesn't work very well, lowers brain glutamate. But we have found after we saw this study, we started using it in some of our kids. One little girl I was working with, she had severe autism. She had severe attention problems, severe anxiety. We got those under control, but she still didn't converse. I started this medicine, Aricept, or memantine. The next visit within a month, first time in 5 years we had a reciprocal conversation. Her mom said, she looked at me the other day and said, "Mom, do you think I'm on the right medicine?" Total different perception, all because it lowered her brain glutamate. We've got about 20 kids on memantine now, some more dramatically improved, some not, but it changed everything. Okay, genes and behavior, I don't care. One last thing, I can't help it, my lack of serotonin made me do it. Okay, relationship between genes and behavior, environment. So these are what happens in a stable home, and this is one gene called an MAOI. It determines how fast your hormones or your neurotransmitters get reduced. So if you got high activity in MAOI or low activity, if you're in a stable home, there's no significant difference. So that genetic variation makes no difference at all. But if you're in an abusive home, which we know can be really damaging to the developing brain, look at what happens if you got the high MAO, high. Look what happens if you got the low level. Look at the difference. Abusive home, one gene, the alternative gene. In a stable home, it makes no difference. But look at the dramatic levels of dysfunction that occur when you're in an abusive home with that one gene. Wow. Whole different outcome. So part of this is what we're trying to do is to integrate our environmental influence. And this has been the biggest effect over the last 50 years that most of us have lived in and learned about, is that environmental impact. But it doesn't change this underlying genetic study. Okay, let's go ahead and stop there. Okay, so we will
Q&A.
leave it. All right, that's good. Tom?
Would you mind saying something about the brain's ability to compensate for injury?
As far as I know, I'm not an expert in that field. Neurologists are better. I'm sorry. Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, thank you. So brain's ability to handle to injury. We know that the brain is changeable. We know we grow new nerves called neuroplasticity. We know that after a stroke, we know that after head trauma, our brain can regenerate those nerves. Sometimes it takes a long time, sometimes a short time. But yeah, so we have a stroke, our brain can regenerate, but it takes time, it takes a lot of work, but the reality is, yes, it does and can, but it's variable, and I don't think anybody can tell you, even with brain scans at this point, how that recovery works and what's the likelihood. So it's all left with trial and observation.
I wish I could keep going, but my question, I'm thinking about your chemistry professor who said half of what you were taught is wrong.
Which is wrong, I don't know which half that is.
Is that still a thing today? Or
You know,
more interesting-
probably not. We've come so far since the 40s.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not half. I don't believe it's half anymore, but there are things that obviously I'm saying today that may change. No, I don't think it's true anymore.
Would it be a more interesting statistic, like how much you think you still don't know?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, we still don't know a lot of this stuff. How much don't we know? There is so much we don't know. The big goal now is to try to identify genes and brain scanning to help us do a better job in diagnosing when somebody's brains aren't working better. Daniel Amen wrote a book called The End of Mental Illness. He also wrote a book before this, about 15 years earlier, called Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, which talks about the medical intervention to help people's brains work better. But yeah, he's saying we should be able to be there in the next 10 to 15 years in eliminating mental illness or mental dysfunction, which is exciting.
You just mentioned neuroplasticity, and I wonder if you'd say a few words about neuroplasticity in older people.
So again, it's not my expertise. All I know is it does work, but it's harder as we get older to have those nerves go and regenerate. Some of it has to do with what's called nerve growth factor, but we're finding some things that are valid. That's a whole different talk, but there's a number of things that we're discovering that do have an impact, like this thing on coffee this week. There's something about the coffee, but it may not be, it may be the caffeine, but it may be something else that's in coffee that makes a difference. That people will be identifying that. So we do know that as we get older, it's harder, but exercise seems to help. Because when you're exercising, you're actually causing muscle, you get nerve growth factor working better in your brain. So it happens, and there are things you can do. There are some medicines and supplements that seem to make a difference, like omega-3 fatty acids, fish oil derived. The EPA and the DHA forms nerve lining in the brain. Okay, so the nerves actually are more robust, and they get bigger when you're using, if you're having salmon 2 or 3 times a week, you're fine. Most of us don't, but nerve growth factor, there's there with exercise. So a lot of things are going on.
My grandson was a child that was abandoned in Lebanon as a baby. We have no idea of his biological genetic history. He was in an orphanage for 2 years, and then he came to San Francisco, where my daughter lives. His childhood was normal until he was 12 years old, and then he started developing all these things that you've talked about: anxiety, ADHD, and finally a psychiatrist diagnosed him as bipolar when he was 13 years old. And the problem that I'm having with all these psychiatrists, he's had 3, is they don't agree. They don't agree on the medication, and he has to be on medication or he can't function. And I wonder if you have any insight into why there's such a disagreement in medication for children that have bipolar.
Anytime you see that much variation,
Yeah.
it's because we don't have all the answers to the questions that are being raised.
Yeah.
So we're flying by the seat of our pants on experience, and the reality is, unless we have good diagnostic studies, you are left with just having to try and see what happens. Because you're right, because it's not based on good, solid ability to do brain scans or understand genetic influence. The first 2 years that we saw with all these kids in Romania, that's a horrible experience for the brain. The first 2 years of that deprivation, which probably existed before it was adopted.
I've always thought that the first 2 years are very important.
They are. And we didn't used to understand how important
And
they
they
were.
don't spend enough time on that because he was in a war-torn country.
Oh, my God. It
Right.
was horrible. Yeah, it was probably,
Yeah.
because all that cortisol, all that stress in the brain changed the way the brain develops.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Skip, this is sort of a fun question. We're in the middle of the Olympics, and we've come through the Super Bowl, and you've been at these parties where we've jumped up and screamed and yelled and laughed. And what's going on with our brain when that happens? And is that helpful to our brain, or is that detrimental?
Yeah, so watching is different in our brain than interacting. There are some computer programs now. Judy's work, my wife is working with Human Good, that a lot of you know, and they are working with a company that is actually working with a company that's working with computer programs that actually, there are a lot of people in the country doing it, but actually the speed of processing when you're interacting improves and reduces cognitive decline 25 to 30%. Okay? So that's early stages of research, but it's there. So when you're watching a screen, it's different, and you're kind of going into the default mode network until you start yelling because you're excited. Then you're TAC active. But when you're interacting, one of the biggest risks is now what's happening to kids with phones or computer games. And when you're there, you're causing a big dopamine release in the brain, and it's addictive
for some kids. So it depends on what you're doing, whether it's passive viewing or active viewing, if the active viewing helps or if it creates more problems. It does both.
So it's okay to scream?
It's okay to scream and, scream and yell and do whatever you want, because that takes you out of the default mode and puts you tax active, absolutely.
One more question.
I am interested, Skip, in the very young child and screen time. And I know the American Association has shifted on their
Right.
recommendations, and I haven't kept up on what's the latest. Do you have a?
Yeah, it's in the state of flux, and part of that's because we don't have the research to back it up yet. So they try to wait until they've got some evidence. But yeah, so young children less than 5 should not be doing interaction. Watching TV is different, whatever. But the biggest thing is, it's duration of action or duration of activity that creates the way the brain grows and develops. So if you're sitting in front of TV 12 hours a day, that's different than if you're there for half an hour. So the reality is, it's a matter of duration of what you do. So if you sit and watch TV, it's different than sitting and reading. It's different than doing crossword puzzles. It's different than doing a computer game. So yeah, so it can be really damaging. We're seeing a lot of kids that are developing addiction early on, but they're probably predisposed to developing addiction, so some kids don't get a thrill out of it at all. So yeah, there's a real concern, and you're going to see big changes and recommendations occur over the next couple of years. But yeah, avoiding it and putting controls on it is driving a lot of parents nuts. It's been so difficult.
Okay. One more question.
When you talk about eradicating mental illness in 15 years, or at least, how much a part of that is artificial intelligence in making that happen?
Good question. It's going to be a big issue, and I think we're all going to be trying to deal with it. Most of us, it won't be us, but it'll be our kids trying to deal with this stuff. Artificial intelligence is going to be a big factor at some advantage, but artificial intelligence is turning into bullying, all artificially. Last week there was a report of a programmer that wanted to eliminate a code in an artificial intelligence program. All of a sudden there was a 3-page summary of why he was ridiculous and why he was not honest that this artificial intelligence program wrote. And another fellow, when his AI program found out that he had had an affair, he actually went ahead, the artificial intelligence program, challenged him and almost said, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to reveal this. So we've got some real things that we need to think about. How do we manage this brain functioning independently of morals and caring? Because artificial intelligence doesn't have any humanity, caring. There's no empathy. I don't know.
Okay.
We've got to figure it out, but we need to put some controls on it.
Thank you. Let's thank him. Next week, the Bostroms are introduced, and so come for that, 3:30. Thanks. You already know them. Yeah, right on.